Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to use a couple of the dies from the Weekender kit as well as the 3D embossing folder to create this wine glass or cocktail glass water shaker card. So I'm using the Tropical Flare die set, which is this one, the Sunset in a Glass die set, which is the first one I showed, and then I'm using the Lush Leaves 3D embossing powder or embossing folder. I have a piece of holographic cardstock here that's 3 3/4 by 5 3/4, and I'm cutting a wine glass out of the center. The holographic cardstock itself is going to be used for a mat around my wine glass element in the front, but I am going to use the outline of the holographic wine glass. And rather than using 2 pieces of cardstock, I might as well cut that wine glass out of the part that's going to be covered anyways. No one's going to know. The white piece here for the front of my card for my water shaker element is 3.5 inches by 5.5 inches. So I position that wine glass exactly where I want it to be on that piece for the front of my card and then set that aside. For the embossed part of my card front here, I have a piece of 4 3/4 by 6 3/4 Waterfall cardstock, and I'm embossing that using the stacking for 3D embossing folders in my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. I like to do that ahead of everything because I like to mist my cardstock lightly to soften those paper folds so that I can set that all aside to dry completely before I need it. I have a whole bunch of elements here that I cut off screen. Most of them are done with cardstock scraps. These blues here are Waterfall cardstock from Spellbinders as well as teal topaz. And the white cardstock that I'm using for my 5x7 card base is just accent opaque cardstock. It's the one that I use most often for my card bases. For the inking for these leaves as well as the umbrella, I'm using some Pine Needles Distress ink. And I just ink blended it with an ink blending brush. I just wanted to give it a little bit of shading and dimension. It just adds a little bit of interest here. I'm going to glue that onto the bottom of my card base, and then there's the top part of the umbrella that I'm going to glue on top of it. I'm using Barely Art Glue in a fine line bottle, and I like to put my pieces underneath an acrylic block while they're drying. It keeps them nice and flat, make sure that glue has good contact, as well as the fact that it frees up my hands for what I want to do next. For these flowers, I have 2 small flowers and 1 larger flower, and I'm using saltwater taffy to do the ink blending with a detailed ink blending brush on those smaller flowers, and then I'm going to use abandoned coral on the large flower. I'm using that same blending brush. The colors are so similar that you can use the same brush. That's why I started with a lighter one so that I wouldn't get any of that darker color onto those smaller flowers. That big flower there, I'm going to glue just a white center to it. I'm not going to bother gluing a center to those smaller flowers. I'm going to add a little bit of stickles at the end for some sparkle, and I didn't really feel that it needed a center to the flower for the way that I had planned on arranging them. But I am going to put that flower underneath that acrylic block there, again, to keep everything having good contact as well as keeping it flat while it's drying and keeping my hands free. For the little lemon slice, I'm using some Squeeze Lemonade Distress ink. I have the background of the lemon slice as well as the seeds done in white, and that's what I did the inking on. And then the inner part of the lemon is just done with a scrap or a die cut with a scrap of yellow cardstock. Once again, gluing those things in place and then setting them aside. I like to assemble all of my die cuts, especially the ones that have layers, and do all my ink blending ahead of time. And then I have everything ready to go when I want to start doing my assembly. It's always nice to have that all ready and not have to stop in the middle of something to either die cut something or do some ink blending. So with all of those pieces done and ready to go when I need them, I can start assembling my water shaker element. I have a piece of acetate here, and it's just big enough to cover the wine glass part of my die cut opening here. You don't need to have it covering the entire thing because we only need it in front of the wine glass. That's where the opening for that die cut is. I'm using some strong double-sided tape here. This is Suk Wang, and it's about 1/4 inch wide. You can use whatever your favorite double-sided tape is for there. I have been using Suk Wang for years, and I know that it's not, or that it's going to hold up and it's not going to start falling apart, and it's also not going to dry up on me after a few years. So I like using that for most of the things where I need double-sided tape. So I put that piece of acetate in that opening there, and then I'm going to use that Barely Art glue just to glue down my wine glass inside that opening on the front of the card. So I flipped that white piece over with the acetate on it, so that acetate is now glued onto that back piece there, and I'm gluing the wine glass onto the front. I put some glue on the bottom of the wine glass, but there's nothing to actually glue it to. So it's really just going right onto my desk there. So if you have a piece of acetate that only covers the wine glass, you don't need to put that glue on the bottom yet. You can glue that down later. I'm putting my straw in right now as well because I want that to look like it's going inside the glass. So I didn't want my wine glass glued down completely before putting that down. I'm going to grab another acrylic block and put that down to hold that down. I want to make sure that that is especially held down so that that glue can dry on that wine glass, and make sure that it has good contact. And once again, freeing my hands up. For the water shaker element, I like to use a Ziploc bag, and you need to make sure that your Ziploc bag is bigger than the opening in the front of your card. You don't want to be able to see the sides of that bag there. These ones here I just got from the dollar store. I'm putting just a little bit of water in there. I want to say it fills maybe up about a ½ inch. You don't need a ton of water there because I want to be able to have it lay fairly flat. In order to color that water, I'm just using some distress reinker. This one is saltwater taffy. You can use whatever color it is that you want for the drink that you're wanting to go for. I chose this because it was one of the colors that was used to ink blend on those white flowers. So I wanted the drink to coordinate with the accessories that I had here. When I go to close this Ziploc bag, I want to take most of that air out there. I don't want to have a bunch of air at the top. So in order to close that bag and make sure that most of that air is not in there, I laid it down while I was doing that. You want to make sure that that seal is sealed very tight. You don't want to chance that there's any opening at all, because then it's going to leak all over your card. In order to make sure that it's sealed, I put it upside down and make sure to shake it, and I make sure nothing comes out. And then I also use some of my spellbinders yellow tape. You could use washi tape. You could use whatever tape you want for this. And I tape that top opening of that bag closed on both sides. And then I just take my scissors and trim off the excess tape from the outer edge. I trim it about a 1/4 inch or to an 1/8 inch away from the edge of that bag. Don't really need that extra tape hanging off the side, but I want to make sure that is good and taped. And then the last thing I did with this bag before starting to assemble it or add it to my card is I took some thinner yellow tape and I folded that top part of the bag down just to the Ziploc part. I just wanted to be able to put that bag as high up on my card as possible. And by folding it down, it just eliminated some of the space that it was taking up at the top there. It's also going to be kind of the third defense to make sure that that bag doesn't accidentally leak. So now that our shaker element or our water pouch is ready, we can glue that to our card. So I'm going to use that same double-sided tape, my Suk Wang tape that I used to glue the acetate on there. I'm putting pieces right outside of the die cut area, the opening area, because I want to make sure that the bag sticks really, really well to that. And then I'm also putting some pieces towards the bottom so that the bag will also sit to that. I want to make sure that there's as much contact with adhesive as possible so that that bag stays where I put it. I don't want it to shift or move once everything is together, because once everything's together, that bag is pretty much encased and there's not really any way to shift it or move it or adjust it after that. With that tape in place, I can take the backing off and then I can glue that bag there. And when I'm gluing the bag behind that window there, I want to make sure that Ziploc top to the top of the bag is above the top of my die cut. I want to make sure that that is not seen from the front of the card. So I start with that piece up there and then I lay that bag down nice and flat and make sure that it has some good contact with the adhesive behind there. Because that bag of water has a little bit of dimension to it, I'm going to use some foam tape to glue that to my holographic mat for the front of the card. I'm putting some at the top and then I'm going to put a couple rows at the bottom. And then for the side of the glass, I'm going to measure how much the opening is between the foam tape that I have on the bottom and the foam tape that I have on the top. Cut a piece that size, and then I'm going to cut it in half lengthwise just to make it a little bit narrow. This particular foam tape is a little bit too wide to go on the side of those glasses that glass as it is. So by cutting it in half, I can narrow it and I can still get that dimension. After doing this, put that piece on my mat just to see if it had enough dimension to it, if it gave it enough space for that water pouch. And for this particular card, it did. If you wanted to give it some extra dimension, you can add an additional layer of that foam tape and just give it that extra space and that extra dimension. I wanted it to have some, well, it needs to have some dimension to accommodate for that pouch, but I didn't want it to have too much dimension. Sometimes if it has too much dimension, because of the water in there, it's a little bit front heavy. So by having it not as dimensional, it eliminated that bit. If you find that your card is front heavy, you can add some mats to the inside of your card and make, or add a little bit of weight to that back there just to counteract that. So with those pieces of foam on there and it's got enough dimension for what I'm looking for, I can take the backing off of that foam and I can glue it down to another piece of white cardstock. This piece of white cardstock is a little bit smaller than the one on the front, so I cut this to 3 1/4 by 5 1/4. And the reason I cut this piece here is so that that water pouch had a white backing to it. If I didn't do that, it would just show up whatever color I put this onto. And I wanted to make sure that I could see the color of that liquid, how it's meant to be seen. So by putting a piece of white cardstock back there, basically I encased that entire piece, as well as made sure that that glass opening for the water shaker has the true color of the liquid in it. So now I can take my Suk Wang tape, put it around the edges, and I can glue it to this holographic piece. And this is the piece that I had at the beginning that I cut that wine glass out of. Once again, you could use 2 separate pieces of cardstock, but when it's going to be completely covered, we might as well get double use out of it. A lot of specialty cardstock is fairly expensive, so by being able to get double use out of it, it's a good way to make your cardstock stretch, especially the specialty ones. So I'm putting it on this piece here, just making sure to have a nice even mat all the way around. And now the water shaker element is empty, or is finished. It's empty. So you can see how you can see the top part being a little bit clear, or you can see the white behind it. And then you can see the fluid on there. You could make your pouch not nearly as full, so you see a little bit more of the white background behind it. I wanted to have my glass fairly full, but it's really personal preference. If you didn't want it quite as full as I have it here, you just put less water in there and your pouch will be less full. And it's also going to have a little bit less dimension that way as well. I forgot to add the umbrella when I was putting my straw in there earlier, so I have to do that now. And fortunately, I can pull up this wine glass, the rim of the wine glass a little bit to put that in there. Because the glue is on the acetate, it wasn't quite completely dry because it's only drying from one side, so I could still fit that in there. I wanted to put this lemon on the side of the glass. At this point, I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to do it. I was still figuring it out in my head. So I'm going to put the flowers onto the front of the card. I like to curve my flower petals with my fingers just to give them a little bit of extra dimension. And then I put some of the glue just on the center of those flowers. And I started putting it here on the glass, and then I decided that I didn't really like it there. So I ended up putting it at the bottom or at the base of the glass. I liked the arrangement there a lot better, and I thought it looked a little bit more natural because we wouldn't really have a glass that had flowers kind of on the bottom of it. Fortunately, because I'm using that Barely Art glue, it's really easy to wipe it off of the area that I had it on. And then because I only had that glue on the center of the flower, there wasn't really a ton of it there either. So I'm doing that same curving of the flower petals on all of the flowers and then gluing that down to the base. Then I'm going to add those leaves there. These are the ones that I did some ink blending on at the beginning of the video. I like to curve these kind of in a bit of an S shape. So I like to make sure that I have a flat area at the base to glue the leaves down. You can see there that it's a little bit of an S shape. I only put the glue on that base part of the leaf, and then it comes out of the flower, or out from behind the flower, and kind of goes up and then curves. And by doing this, I have a nice flat edge to glue, but I still get some dimension and curve in those leaves. So now that that floral element is done, I can put that lemon on, and I decided to just put a little snip in there so that I could kind of hang it off of the rim of the glass, or give it the appearance that it's hanging off the rim of the glass. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't covering my umbrella by doing that. And I just glued it down with that same Barely Art glue. And I like how it looks like it's hanging right off the edge of the glass there. So the last thing I wanted to add was a little bit of stickles. I'm going to put a little bit on the umbrella, a little bit on the seeds and the outline of the lemon, as well as on my straw and the center of my flowers. I always love adding a touch of stickles because it adds just a bit of sparkle. It's one of those things, though, I think less is more, so I don't always add a ton, just in little areas, just to add a little bit of extra texture and, like I said, some sparkle. I want my card to have some sentiment, so I'm taking the Cheers stamp from the Weekender stamp set, as well as the Shake It Up sentiment. I'm doing the Shake It Up one on the inside of the card, and the Cheers one, I'm going to just do a little flag for the straw that is in my glass. So before I use any acrylic stamp, I take a white eraser and I just rub it over the stamping surface of the stamp. It takes any manufacturing residue off, and it helps that stamp be able to take ink a little bit more. You also want to use a brush in order to get any of that eraser residue off of there, because it's going to interfere with the stamping of the stamp. So you want to make sure that that is all completely off of there as well. For my Cheers stamp, I'm using the green, the Pine Needles Distress ink pad. And then for the Shake It Up on the inside of the card, I'm going to use the Saltwater Taffy. I'm stamping it a couple times just to make sure I have a nice, crisp, clear stamped image, and then I will set that aside to dry. This is my 5x7 card base, and I'm going to stamp the Shake It Up sentiment right on the inside of that card there, placing it where I want it to go, and then stamping it twice again. Well, I didn't use the Saltwater Taffy, I used the Abandoned Coral. I wanted it nice and bright. So once again, stamped it twice just to make sure that I have a crisp, clean image, and then set that aside to completely dry. There are two different little flag dies in that Sunset in a Glass die set. So I picked the one that I liked for the Cheers sentiment, made sure to tape it in place so that it didn't move or anything when I went to go die cutting it. My background is completely dry now, so I can do my ink blending on here. I'm just using that same Pine Needles Distress ink, and I'm only going to ink blend on the bottom about half. I'm making sure that that ink is lighter at the bottom, darker at the bottom and lighter towards the top. I'm not really paying much attention to the center of this piece here because that wine glass is going to be right in front of it, so you're not even going to see that. Once that embossed piece is completely ink blended, I can glue that to the front of my card. I want to make sure to put glue all over those areas, especially the areas that are going to have contact with that card base. I want to make sure that that is glued down really, really well. Center that on the front of my card, and then once again put an acrylic block on there just to hold it down while it's drying. Especially embossed images as well as watercolor images, they will often have some bows and bends in them, and you want to make sure that it has some good contact with it while it's drying. And then I can glue down my little glass element. Now this flag here, it has a little piece that you can fold over and then glue behind the wine glass. I ended up cutting that piece right off because I didn't like that little flag on the on the top part of the straw. I wanted on the other side, and that part was already glued down completely. So I just cut that little piece off to go towards the back and then glued it down. I had one extra leaf left from my ink blending and my die cutting, so I just put that with the little flag there. Might as well use it rather than waste it, because it matches it perfectly and I like it on there as well. So here is the finished card with that shaker element in there. I absolutely love the way it looks, and I love the way that you can see the liquid move in that glass while you're moving it. The first angle there wasn't quite easy enough to see the liquid in the glass there moving, so there's another one there. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you spending the time with me, and I hope you have a fantastic day.